The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the downtown apartment complex, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what should have been another ordinary Tuesday evening. Sarah Martinez had just finished her shift at the local hospital where she worked as a registered nurse. At 28, she had dedicated her life to helping others, often putting her patients' needs before her own. Her small apartment on the third floor was her sanctuary, a place where she could decompress after long days of saving lives and comforting families. As she unlocked her door, Sarah could hear the muffled sounds of her neighbor's television through the thin walls. The building was old, built in the 1960s, and sound traveled easily between units. She had grown accustomed to the various noises: children playing, couples arguing, the elderly Mrs. Henderson's afternoon cooking shows. But, tonight, something felt different. The sounds from apartment 3B next door weren't the usual sitcom laugh tracks or evening news broadcasts. Sarah set down her purse and kicked off her nursing shoes, her feet aching from a particularly demanding 12-hour shift. She had dealt with 3 emergency cases that day, including a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and a young mother who had been brought in after a car accident. The emotional weight of her job sometimes followed her home, but she had learned to compartmentalize, to find peace in her own space. As she moved toward her kitchen to prepare a simple dinner, the sounds from next door became clearer and more disturbing. There was shouting, a man's voice, deep and aggressive, followed by what sounded like pleading from a woman. Sarah paused, her hand frozen on the refrigerator door handle. In her line of work, she had seen the aftermath of domestic violence too many times. She recognized the patterns, the escalation, the desperate tone in a victim's voice. The apartment next door had been rented just 3 months ago by a couple she had only seen in passing. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of military bearing that suggested discipline and authority. He always wore crisp clothing and walked with purpose. The woman was petite, perhaps in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a shy demeanor. Sarah had tried to make friendly conversation in the hallway once, but the woman had seemed nervous, glancing repeatedly toward her apartment door as if afraid someone might appear. Now, as the voices next door grew louder, Sarah's medical training kicked in. She knew the signs of escalating domestic violence, had seen too many women arrive in her emergency room with injuries that told a story of systematic abuse. The shouting continued, punctuated by the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, the shared wall between their apartments. Sarah moved closer to the wall, her heart racing. She could make out fragments of the argument. The man was accusing the woman of something, his voice filled with rage and control. The woman's responses were barely audible, apologetic and frightened. This wasn't just a heated disagreement between partners, this was something much more sinister. Her phone was in her hand before she even realized she had picked it up. Should she call the police? In her experience, domestic violence calls were complicated. Often, victims were too afraid to press charges, or they would retract their statements later out of fear or misguided loyalty. But she also knew that intervention could be the difference between life and death. The arguing stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more frightening than the shouting had been. Sarah pressed her ear against the wall, straining to hear any indication of what was happening on the other side. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, she heard it, a sharp crack followed by a cry of pain. The sound was unmistakable to someone who had worked in trauma medicine. Someone had been struck, and, from the pitch of the cry, it was definitely the woman. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911, but, before she could press the call button, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were moving away from apartment 3B. Sarah crept to her peephole and peered out into the dimly lit corridor. The man from next door was walking toward the elevator, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. He was wearing dark clothing and moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command and authority. As he waited for the elevator, Sarah could see his profile, a strong jaw, close-cropped hair, and the kind of physical presence that suggested military or law enforcement background. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and he disappeared inside. Sarah waited until she heard the mechanism carrying him down before she acted on the impulse that her nursing instincts demanded. She couldn't ignore what she had heard. Someone next door needed help, and her oath to do no harm extended beyond the hospital walls. She knocked softly on the door of apartment 3B. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" Her voice was gentle but loud enough to be heard through the door. There was no response, but she could hear movement inside, tentative, careful movements that suggested someone was trying not to make noise. "My name is Sarah. I live next door. I'm a nurse, and I heard. I just want to make sure you're all right." She kept her voice calm and professional, the same tone she used with frightened patients in the emergency room. Still no response, but the movement inside had stopped completely. Sarah tried a different approach. "I know how scary this can be. I see women in the hospital all the time who are in similar situations. You don't have to face this alone." She paused, listening for any sign that her words were being heard. "I'm going to leave my phone number under your door. If you need help, any kind of help, you can call me. Day or night." She tore a piece of paper from a notepad in her purse and wrote her name and number, along with a brief message: "You deserve to be safe. Call me if you need help or just someone to talk to. Sarah, Apt 3A." She slid the note under the door and heard it being picked up almost immediately from the other side. As she returned to her own apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed the beginning of something that could escalate quickly and dangerously. Her experience in emergency medicine had taught her that domestic violence situations often followed predictable patterns, building in intensity until they reached a breaking point. Someone with the bearing and apparent training of the man she had seen could cause serious damage, and the woman next door seemed completely isolated and vulnerable. Sarah spent the rest of the evening on edge, jumping at every small sound from the building's heating system or the footsteps of other residents in the hallway. She tried to focus on a medical journal she had brought home, but her mind kept wandering to the frightened woman next door. She wondered about her background, how she had ended up in this situation, and what resources might be available to help her escape. Around midnight, as Sarah was finally preparing for bed, she heard the elevator doors open in the hallway. The same heavy footsteps approached apartment 3B, and she heard the jingling of keys. The man had returned. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see if the night would bring another escalation of violence. For the next hour, the apartment next door was silent. Either the woman had learned to suffer in complete silence, or the man was exercising a different kind of control, the kind that didn't require raised voices or physical violence, just the implicit threat of what could happen if she stepped out of line. As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she made a mental note to research domestic violence resources in the area. If the woman next door ever found the courage to reach out, Sarah wanted to be prepared with concrete help and options. She had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, the situation would explode into something that would make local news and change the lives of everyone involved. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the city clean, while inside apartment 3B, a woman lay awake in the darkness, clutching a small piece of paper with a stranger's phone number, perhaps the first real lifeline she had been offered in months. 2 days had passed since Sarah had slipped her phone number under her neighbor's door, and she was beginning to think the woman would never call. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made the city feel oppressive and claustrophobic. Sarah was getting ready for another shift at the hospital when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Is this Sarah from 3A? This is your neighbor. Can we talk?" Sarah's heart immediately began racing. She quickly typed back, "Yes, this is Sarah. Are you safe right now? Do you need me to call someone?" The response took several minutes to arrive. "He's at work. Can you come over? I don't know who else to talk to." Sarah didn't hesitate. She called the hospital to explain she would be a few hours late due to a personal emergency and knocked softly on the door of apartment 3B. When it opened, she was shocked by what she saw. The woman standing before her was clearly the same person she had glimpsed in the hallway, but she looked like she had aged years in just a few months. "I'm Emma," the woman said quietly, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. "Thank you for leaving your number. I wasn't sure if I should call." Emma Rodriguez was 24 years old, though the fear and exhaustion etched on her face made her appear older. She had been living with Marcus Thompson for 8 months, ever since she had moved to the city to escape an abusive family situation back in Texas. What she had thought was a rescue had turned into something far worse. Marcus was a decorated Navy SEAL officer, recently returned from his 3rd deployment overseas. To the outside world, he was a hero, disciplined, successful, and charming when he needed to be. Emma had met him at a veteran support event where she had been volunteering, drawn to his confidence and the way he seemed to have his life together. In the beginning, he had been protective and caring, offering her stability and security she had never known. But military training that served him well in combat zones had darker applications in civilian life. Marcus approached their relationship with the same tactical mindset he brought to military operations. He had systematically isolated Emma from potential support networks, convinced her to quit her job by offering to support her financially, and gradually established complete control over every aspect of her daily life. As Emma told her story, Sarah recognized the classic patterns of psychological abuse. Marcus monitored Emma's phone calls and internet usage. He controlled all the money and made all decisions about where they went and who they saw. He had convinced Emma that her family back in Texas didn't really care about her, that he was the only person who truly understood and protected her. When psychological control wasn't enough, he had escalated to physical intimidation and violence. "He never hits me in places where it would show," Emma explained, unconsciously touching her ribs where fresh bruises were hidden beneath her sweater. "He knows exactly how much force to use, how to hurt without leaving marks that other people would notice. He says it's because of his training, that he knows the human body better than most people." The incident Sarah had overheard 2 nights earlier had been triggered by Emma's attempt to reconnect with her sister via social media. Marcus had discovered the conversation and flew into a rage, accusing Emma of betraying him and trying to turn his family against him. He had struck her across the face and then spent an hour detailing exactly what would happen if she ever tried to contact anyone from her past again. "He showed me pictures," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Pictures he took when I was sleeping, in the shower, just living my life. He said he has them stored somewhere safe, and if I ever try to leave or cause problems, he'll make sure everyone sees them. He'll ruin my reputation, make sure I can never get a job or have a normal relationship." Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. This wasn't just domestic abuse, it was psychological warfare being conducted by someone with professional training in breaking down human resistance. Marcus was using techniques designed for interrogating enemy combatants on the woman he claimed to love. "Emma, what he's doing is not legal," Sarah said carefully. "Taking intimate photographs without consent, threatening to distribute them, that's criminal behavior. And the physical abuse, you don't have to live like this." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see the fear in Emma's eyes. This wasn't just about physical safety. Marcus had systematically destroyed Emma's sense of self-worth and her belief in her own ability to survive independently. He had convinced her that she was worthless without him, that no one else would ever want or protect her. "You don't understand," Emma said, shaking her head frantically. "He has connections everywhere. Police, military, government. He told me that if I ever tried to get help, he would make sure no one believed me. He said that people always trust a decorated war hero over some nobody girl with a history of family problems." Sarah realized they were dealing with someone who had weaponized his military status and training for domestic terrorism. Marcus had created a perfect trap. Emma was too afraid to seek help because she believed he had the power and connections to destroy her life, and too isolated to realize that there were people and organizations specifically trained to help women in her situation. "Emma, I need you to listen to me," Sarah said, moving closer and speaking in the calm, authoritative voice she used with trauma patients. "I work in a hospital emergency room. I see women in your situation every week. There are laws, there are protections, there are people whose job it is to help you get safe. His military status doesn't put him above the law." For the next hour, Sarah carefully explained the resources available to domestic violence survivors. She talked about restraining orders, safe houses, legal advocacy, and the specialized training that police departments now had for dealing with abusers who had military or law enforcement backgrounds. She emphasized that Emma's case was not hopeless, that Marcus's psychological manipulation was designed to make her feel trapped when she actually had options. But Emma's fear ran deeper than rational assessment of her options. Marcus had spent months conditioning her to believe that any attempt to escape would result in consequences worse than staying. He had detailed scenarios of what would happen if she left, how he would track her down, how he would use his military network to find her anywhere she might try to hide, how he would make sure she lost any job or housing she might secure. "He has a gun," Emma finally whispered, the words hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. "Multiple guns. He cleans them while he talks about what he did overseas, about the people he killed. He makes sure I watch, makes sure I understand that he knows exactly how to make people disappear." Sarah felt the situation crystallizing around them. This wasn't just domestic abuse, it was a hostage situation that happened to be taking place in a civilian apartment instead of a war zone. Marcus was using his military training and resources to hold Emma prisoner through a combination of psychological warfare and implied threats of lethal violence. "Emma, we need to get you somewhere safe," Sarah said quietly. "Today, while he's at work. There are places where you can go where he won't be able to find you, people who specialize in helping women get away from dangerous situations like this." But, even as she spoke, Sarah could see Emma withdrawing emotionally. The moment of connection and trust was fading, replaced by the conditioning Marcus had instilled over months of careful psychological manipulation. Emma was remembering all the reasons why seeking help was impossible, all the ways Marcus had convinced her that the outside world was dangerous and that only he could protect her. "I can't," Emma said, tears beginning to flow. "You don't understand what he's capable of. If he found out I talked to you, if he thought I was planning to leave. He has friends, people who owe him favors from the military. He showed me articles about women who tried to leave their partners and just disappeared." Sarah realized they had reached a critical moment. Emma was teetering on the edge between reaching out for help and retreating completely back into the prison Marcus had constructed around her. Whatever happened next would determine whether this conversation became the first step toward freedom or just another secret Emma would have to carry in terrified silence. As if summoned by their conversation, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. Emma's face went white with terror, and she grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "He's not supposed to be home for hours," Emma whispered, panic making her voice shake. "Something's wrong. He must have found out somehow that I called you." The footsteps stopped directly outside apartment 3B, and they heard the jingle of keys. Marcus Thompson was coming home, and, from the deliberate, controlled way he was moving, it was clear that this wasn't a casual early return from work. This was a man who suspected his carefully maintained control was being threatened, and his military training had taught him exactly how to deal with threats to his operational security. The key turned in the lock with the precision of someone who had done this exact movement thousands of times. Emma's grip on Sarah's arm tightened to the point of pain, and both women held their breath as the door swung open to reveal Marcus Thompson in full military dress uniform. His presence filled the doorway like a storm cloud, and his eyes immediately locked onto Sarah with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear he had expected to find her there. Marcus was an imposing figure even without the psychological advantage he had cultivated over Emma. At 6 feet 3 inches tall, with the kind of physical conditioning that came from years of elite military training, he moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to violence. His uniform was immaculate, every detail perfect, from the precisely arranged ribbons on his chest to the mirror shine on his boots. This was a man who understood the power of presentation and used his military bearing as both shield and weapon. "Ladies," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that was more frightening than shouting would have been. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Sarah felt her nursing training kick in, the same calm professionalism that had carried her through countless medical emergencies. She stood up slowly, positioning herself slightly between Marcus and Emma, and met his gaze directly. "I'm Sarah Martinez from next door," she said evenly. "Emma and I were just having coffee and getting to know each other. Neighbors should look out for each other, don't you think?" Marcus smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Of course. Community is so important, especially for Emma. She's had a difficult time adjusting to life here, coming from such an unstable background. I worry about her sometimes, the way she tends to misinterpret situations or create drama where none exists. The words were carefully chosen, Sarah realized. Marcus was laying the groundwork to discredit anything Emma might have told her, painting her as emotionally unstable and unreliable. It was a tactic she had seen abusers use before, preemptively destroying their victims' credibility. Emma seems perfectly rational to me, Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral but firm. In fact, she was just telling me about some concerns she has about her safety. As a healthcare professional, I take those kinds of concerns very seriously. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Marcus's smile faded, and his posture straightened in a way that suggested military alertness. Emma made a small sound of distress, recognizing the signs that indicated Marcus was transitioning from psychological manipulation to something more dangerous. Emma, Marcus said, his voice still controlled but with an undertone that made Sarah's skin crawl, why don't you go to the bedroom while our neighbor and I have a little chat? Adults are talking now. The dismissive tone and commanding inflection were clearly designed to reinforce Emma's subordinate position in their relationship. But Sarah noticed something else, a slight tremor in Marcus's jaw that suggested his carefully maintained control was beginning to slip. Actually, Sarah said, I think Emma should stay right here. Whatever you want to discuss with me, I'm sure she'd be interested to hear. Marcus took a step into the apartment, and Sarah could see him mentally calculating the distance between himself and the two women, assessing potential threats and advantages. His military training was evident in the way he automatically positioned himself to control access to the door while maintaining a clear view of both potential opponents. You need to understand something, Marcus said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. Emma has a tendency to exaggerate, to create problems where none exist. She's been through some trauma in her past, and sometimes she doesn't see situations clearly. Stay down. The words exploded from Marcus as Emma tried to stand up from the couch. The command was delivered with the kind of automatic authority that had been drilled into him through years of military training, the voice of someone accustomed to instant obedience in life-or-death situations. Emma immediately dropped back onto the couch, her body responding to months of conditioning before her mind could even process the command. But Sarah saw something else in that moment, a flash of pure rage cross Marcus's face as he realized his control was being challenged in front of a witness. That's enough, Sarah said, her voice rising as her own training in crisis intervention took over. Emma, you don't have to follow his orders. This is domestic violence, and I'm calling the police right now. She reached for her phone, but Marcus moved with the speed and precision of someone trained in close-quarters combat. His hand shot out and knocked the phone from her grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. In the same motion, he grabbed Sarah by the shoulder with enough force to make her gasp in pain. You need to mind your own business, he said, his face now inches from hers. You have no idea what you're interfering with here, no understanding of the situation. Emma belongs to me. She needs me to take care of her because she can't take care of herself. The mask of civilized control had finally slipped completely. This was the real Marcus Thompson, the man who had been hiding behind military honor and decorated service. This was someone who viewed relationships as territorial conquests and other people as assets to be controlled and managed. But what Marcus didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had not spent her entire adult life in the sterile environment of hospital corridors. Before nursing school, she had served 4 years in the Marine Corps as a combat medic, deployed twice to Afghanistan where she had learned her own lessons about violence, control, and survival. Her military service had been shorter than his and less decorated, but it had taught her something crucial: how to recognize the difference between someone who used their training to protect others and someone who used it to dominate them. Let go of me, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a different quality now, the kind of calm that came not from professional training but from personal experience with violence. You're making a serious mistake. Marcus's grip tightened, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed her as a potential threat. To him, she was just another civilian woman who could be intimidated and controlled through the application of superior physical force. He had no way of knowing about her military background or the specialized training she had received in dealing with hostile situations. The mistake, Marcus said, was you thinking you could come into my home and turn my woman against me. Emma knows what happens to people who threaten our relationship, don't you, baby? He struck her then, a quick backhand across the face that was delivered with the calculated precision of someone who knew exactly how much force to use. The blow was meant to demonstrate his power and control, to show both women that he could escalate to physical violence whenever he chose. But what happened next was something Marcus Thompson, for all his military training and tactical expertise, had not anticipated. Sarah Martinez didn't cringe or retreat or beg for mercy. Instead, she stepped forward into his personal space and used a joint manipulation technique she had learned in Marine Corps combat training, applying pressure to his wrist in a way that forced him to release her and created enough space for her to move. "You just assaulted a Marine Corps veteran," Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had faced real combat situations. "In front of a witness. That was the last mistake you're going to make today." The revelation that Sarah had military training clearly caught Marcus off guard. His tactical assessment of the situation had been based on the assumption that he was dealing with two civilian women who could be controlled through intimidation and superior force. Now he was facing someone who had been trained to fight back, someone who understood violence from a professional perspective. But, rather than de-escalating, the challenge seemed to trigger something deeper in Marcus's psychology. Perhaps it was the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as a weak civilian. Perhaps it was the recognition that his carefully constructed control over Emma was crumbling in front of his eyes. Whatever the trigger, the result was an explosion of barely controlled rage. Marcus lunged forward, his hands reaching for Sarah's throat with the obvious intention of using his size and strength advantage to overwhelm her. But Sarah had spent 4 years training with some of the most dangerous people on Earth, people who understood that violence was sometimes the only language that bullies and predators truly understood. The fight that followed was brief but decisive. Marcus's military training had been focused on long-range combat and tactical operations, while Sarah's experience as a combat medic had required her to learn close-quarters self-defense techniques designed specifically for situations where larger, stronger opponents tried to overpower smaller defenders. When Marcus committed to his attack, Sarah used his forward momentum against him, applying a defensive technique that sent him stumbling into the coffee table with enough force to stun him temporarily. "Emma, call 911 right now," Sarah said, never taking her eyes off Marcus as he struggled to regain his footing. "Tell them we have an active domestic violence situation with an armed suspect who has just assaulted 2 people. Marcus tried to get up, clearly intending to continue the attack, but Sarah positioned herself in a defensive stance that made it clear she was prepared for whatever he might try next. The combination of his military training and her own created a tactical stalemate, but with one crucial difference: Sarah was fighting to protect someone else, while Marcus was fighting to maintain control over his victim. "This isn't over," Marcus said, blood trickling from where he had struck his head on the table. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, what kind of connections I have. I can make problems for you that you can't even imagine." "The only problem here," Sarah replied, "is a military officer who forgot that his oath was to protect and defend, not to terrorize and control." "Emma, are you calling 911? The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful noise Emma Rodriguez had heard in 8 months. As the police arrived and began taking statements, as Marcus Thompson was handcuffed and informed of his rights, as the whole carefully constructed edifice of fear and control he had built around Emma came crashing down, she finally began to believe that escape was possible. The investigation that followed would reveal that Marcus Thompson had been using his position and security clearances to run background checks on Emma's family and friends, tracking their locations and activities as part of his campaign of psychological intimidation. Military investigators would find evidence that he had been engaging in similar controlling behavior with at least 2 previous partners, both of whom had been too afraid to report him due to his military connections and decorated service record. Sarah Martinez would testify at his court-martial, describing not just the events of that afternoon but the systematic pattern of abuse she had witnessed and the professional way Marcus had weaponized his military training against civilian women. Her own military service record gave her testimony a credibility that civilian witnesses often lacked in cases involving decorated service members. Emma Rodriguez would spend the next year in therapy, working to undo the psychological damage that months of systematic abuse had created. But, with the support of victim advocacy organizations and the knowledge that her abuser was facing serious military and civilian criminal charges, she would slowly rebuild her sense of self-worth and independence. Marcus Thompson, the decorated Navy SEAL officer, would be convicted of domestic violence, assault, stalking, and misuse of government resources. His military career would end in disgrace, his security clearances revoked, and his access to the networks and resources he had used to terrorize Emma permanently severed. The case would become a training example in military justice courses, illustrating how combat training and military authority could be corrupted by individuals who viewed relationships as battlefields and partners as enemies to be conquered. It would also serve as a reminder that true strength, whether gained through military service or civilian life, was measured not by one's ability to control others through fear, but by one's willingness to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. For Sarah Martinez, the incident would reinforce her belief that her military service and medical training had prepared her for more than just treating physical injuries. Sometimes, healing required more than medicine and bandages. Sometimes, it required the courage to stand between predators and their victims, to use strength not for domination but for protection. The apartment building returned to its normal quiet routine within a few weeks, but the residents who had witnessed the police response and learned about the domestic violence situation would be more attentive to the signs of abuse, more willing to intervene when they heard or saw something troubling. Sarah's willingness to get involved had created a ripple effect of awareness and responsibility that would make the building safer for everyone. Emma kept Sarah's phone number, not as a desperate lifeline this time, but as the contact information for a friend who had proven that not all veterans used their training to harm others. Some, like Sarah Martinez, understood that true military values meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, even when that meant standing up to other veterans who had forgotten what honor really meant.